sometimes when I'm talking about diagnosis and sort of philosophical, ethical kind of issues in this, it gets very messy and obviously very heated and very charged, but I don't think just because it's heated and charged doesn't mean we should talk about it. I think it is important. I also think it's very interesting, actually. So I was talking about how diagnosis is a process, okay, not just test results. So how does a clinician really gauge whether or not autism is at the heart of a person's problem, whether or not autism is, if you like, the base upon which all the other symptoms grow? How do they gauge that? And it's very complicated, actually. So, for example, young children, may talk repetitively about dinosaurs they saw at a recent museum visit. Many children do that. This may be age appropriate in young children. Repetitive talking about a particular topic does not necessarily mean that child is autistic, because very young children can be quite repetitive. So how do you judge whether or not that interest is excessive or circumscribed, basically autistic in nature or quality? That requires that other features are demonstrated. So it's not just the presence or absence of a behaviour, it's its quality, which is different in autism, and that requires clinical acumen, that's a word, acumen, that's what it is, isn't it? So there could be, an odd quality, or there might be interference with demands, etc., in a very pervasive and extreme way, which would set it apart from your normal repetitive child, your average, say, 2 to 3 year old. And the same applies to abnormal eye gaze. So abnormal eye gaze is not specific to autism. Abnormal eye gaze occurs across quite a range of different psychiatric conditions. So eye contact does not simply need to be absent or decreased, but there needs to be evidence of poor modulation in the dynamic context of a social interaction. Many atypical behaviours yet are linked to autism are not specific to autism. Counting abnormal behaviours without establishing their specific autistic nature or quality is a source of overdiagnosis. And normative reference data do not exist for many behaviours evaluated during the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. So what is a normal range of facial expressions? Without clinical experience, there could be a risk of pathologising behaviours that are not part of a common experience, albeit not autistic in nature. And they also need to account for the confounding influences of comorbid symptoms in ADOS scores. For example, turn-taking in conversation can be impaired, both because of autism, which would be a failure of normal back and forth conversation, and ADHD. So in ADHD, there can also be issues around turn-taking conversation for different reasons. They might talk excessively, they might blurt out the answers. How do you disentangle whether it's ADHD or autism? Because they can both cause problems in turn-taking conversation. Both are developmental in nature, so they're both going to have early onset. How do you disentangle what is autism, what is ADHD? That takes a lot of clinical experience. So you need clinical judgment about the mechanism underlying the conversation difficulty. So in autism, that would be a pragmatic deficit. There might be theory of mind difficulty. So, you might need to use tests kind of tapping into theory of mind and understanding of people, which is the core impairment of autism, vis-a-vis impulsivity in ADHD. Making matters even more complex, ADHD and autism are often comorbid, so it's possible to have both difficulties. And many, in actual fact, the vast majority of autistic people do have traits of ADHD. So both processes can be at work in the same person. Impulsivity and pragmatic difficulties can exist in the same person, which can make things even harder. So in order for a clinician to work this out, they need to have experience in both autism but also general psychopathology as well, and differential diagnosis. So they need to combine findings from different observations across contexts informants, and data collection procedures. Going to need both direct observation, caregiver reports, school evaluations. All of that adds to the picture. Now, interestingly, by the way, early age of symptom onset was removed from the latest Diagnostic Statistical Manual, DSM-5, as a formal diagnostic criterion. But the concept of autism as a disorder manifesting in early years remains. Nosographies, that's to say sort of like the diagnostic descriptions, if you like, specify symptoms may be present currently or by history, but that's quite kind of vague. How do you determine that symptoms were present by history? You need to go back in time. You need multiple sources of information. If evaluation process relies on current symptom profiles, again, the specificity obtained by demonstrating an early origin to symptom trajectory is lost. So again, there are problems here around those who don't have parents there, parental informants, or other vital sources that can raise diagnostic issues. And then there's the issue around impairment. Okay, social impairment is a non-specific feature of ASD. Social impairment occurs in the context of most psychiatric disorders. However, social impairment arising due to autism is not quite the same as that resulting from other disorders. For example, peer relationship difficulties may result from anxiety or the fear of social evaluation in an anxious child, from disruptive behaviours in those with externalising disorders, impulsivity in those with ADHD, or from a lack of social motivation or know-how in a child with autism. So that is the underpinning there. So I guess, in my case, when I was going back to when I was a young child, I wasn't socially anxious at all, quite the opposite. But I didn't have the understanding, the social know-how of how to integrate myself amongst my peers. I just didn't have it at all. That was something that other informants picked up on. My parents and school teachers all picked up on that. And there's a lot of evidence that was used when I got diagnosed, going back from when I was at school, from a very early age, to show the difficulty there. And even though my diagnosis is pretty solid, or as solid as it can be, I still, short of a blood test, I still always, autism for me is always in a sense in quote marks, because it's just the best fit for the difficulties I have. If that changes in future because of new research or anything like that, that won't bother me, because it's not an identity, it just best fits the profile I have and the difficulties I have. But anyway, so you need to look at what is causing the social problem. And that's very important. The more evidence, the better. Which is why I'm very grateful, actually. I did have that report done at primary school, because it really did help, in providing that evidence as well, that it was in black and white. So attributing impairment specifically to ASD in a context of comorbid presentation requires clinical acumen in autism and general psychopathology and the experiencing a differential diagnosis. And obviously, the older a person gets, the more likely they are to accrue additional psychopathologies. So disentangling what is what becomes increasingly messy, which is why it is best to have parents there, people who knew the person from when they were very young, before these other conditions developed, and school reports and all of those other things is important. In recent research studies, criteria to include participants are increasingly relying on loose characterisation of participants. For example, inclusion criteria limited to self-completed autism checklists and or self-reported diagnosis. And this can result in the unintentional inclusion of non-autistic participants, which can muddy the results. Indeed, that is, I find that very annoying when I see online, they include self-diagnosed people, and that is obviously going to introduce noise into the data. That's really bad practice. I don't know why that's allowed. It's quite hot water. And this then decreases the power to detect treatment effects in randomised control trials and in etiologic studies, so that's to say studies that are looking into causation and things like that. Inclusion in ASD case groups will bias the results towards the null. So just introduce all this noise into the data, you end up with basically, a nothing result. How can you interpret it, So in order to get around these problems, you need A, reliance on several informants or data sources, B, supplementing evaluation of current functioning with other data points that confirm a trajectory of autistic symptomatology over time, and C, demonstrating functional impairment results from demonstrating functional impairment results from underlying autistic disturbances as opposed to co-occurring conditions. So that's quite a lot a clinician needs to take into account of. And I do think that in this cost-cutting era, where they are basically cutting funding, unfortunately is going to affect diagnosis both for the better and for the worse. So you're going to see many people being underdiagnosed, and unfortunately also quite a lot of people being wrongly diagnosed. And this can have all sorts of repercussions. So thank you for watching.